Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thanks for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. In 2019, the world had a better chance to witness the strength and compassion of the El Paso region. My guest today knew about that long before the tragic mass shooting that claimed 22 lives. Minerva Baumann grew up in El Paso and has lived in the region for her entire life. She's a friend and colleague at New Mexico State University, serving as Media Relations Officer here. And you may know her from a former El Paso Times column. A collection of those columns now make up the book Ordinary Angels, Stories of Daily Life in El Paso del Norte. I'm so happy to have with us Minerva Baumann. Hi, Minerva.
Hi, Fred. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you here today. And I want to start with those columns in the El Paso Times and how you came up with so many wonderful stories.
Well, initially, the way the columns came about is that Chris Lopez, who was the editor at the time, put out a call to the community asking for people to send in columns about El Paso. And I was one of 4 people that they selected to do these columns. And my columns were just about people that I met around El Paso and the kindness and the generosity, community spirit that I encountered, virtually on a daily basis, just regularly. And I wanted people to experience El Paso the way I did. To see the city the way I do. Mother Teresa said often that there are no large acts, only small acts with great love, right? And that's really what it is. It's these kinds of intimate stories that talk about people who you might see on the street every day who are willing to lend a hand or help a person just out of the goodness of their heart. It's just who they are.
The book's title, Ordinary Angels, is also the title of the first column that we read in the book. And we have a photo of an angel given to you that accompanied that column. Tell me about it.
Yes, well, that story is about how circumstances can come together to lead a person to exactly what they need just when they need it. Now, I found that store downtown. I was looking for dresses in downtown El Paso, and I came across this Angels via Michael, which was actually originally the Central Furniture Store. And it was such an interesting story. I ended up there, and just at the time when a friend of mine who had a brain tumor was undergoing surgery and recovering from that, and this place was a marvelous treasure trove of hope and inspiration for someone who needed it. So it was the perfect place for me to stumble onto. And you realize that these kinds of small miracles just happen every day. You have to be aware of it and be thinking about it at the time. It was the perfect thing for me.
And in your words, you write, whenever compassion, kindness, and generosity exist, you'll find angels. And that's a central theme in the book, that sometimes in life, things happen that makes us feel like there is another force at work.
You're right about that, but it's not mysterious. A lot of times we pray for God to help us. But really, when you think about it, we could be the answer to someone's prayers. If we just look around and recognize our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, and maybe there's something that we can do to lend a hand to them just when they need it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You have a quote from the last story in the book, "Home is where you take it," about the character of El Paso. Could you read that for me?
So here's the passage. Home is not simply where we live. Home lives in us. It's how we see the world and interact with it. No matter where we travel, we can all share the soul of our city each time we share our stories. Because to each new friend we meet, we are El Paso. Yeah. And you could say the same thing for Las Cruces or wherever we're from, because people will have an impression and a feeling about that place because they've met you.
Yeah, and I think that was a good time to read that, because sometimes those moments in our lives happen when we really need them. I know that that's happened for me many times with friends, with sometimes strangers even, people that I'm meeting for the first time, who share an experience that really resonates. I want to move on to another column that I really enjoyed in the book, called Art or Activism, and we get to hear about mural projects in El Paso. This is something that we're seeing as well in Las Cruces. Lots of wonderful artists who are doing murals, and we have some photos in your book that we're going to share as well. You write that these programs are very important because they not only offer beauty, but an important outlet for young artists.
Right. I know many years ago, the Junior League had a program in which they invited at-risk youth to work with professional muralists to do murals all around South El Paso. And when I went around to some of those, when I was writing this column, I realized many of them were not in very good shape. And a lot of them were tattered. They were, people had written over them. Some of them were flaking off and various kinds of things. They were sorely neglected. But they demonstrate how these kinds of group projects can help our community come together and show pride and let El Paso youth express their talent and feel appreciated and recognized for that. Most recently they tore down a bunch of the murals that were on some freeway supports and the Spaghetti Bowl in El Paso, and there was a lot of community activism in trying to preserve those murals. And so some were preserved, but others had to be taken down because of the new freeway. But the Texas Department of Transportation has said that those murals will now be an opportunity for new artists to come and make creations there too. So
that is great. And I'm glad you celebrated that in your book. Fender Bender is a wonderful personal story of yours about compassion. We talked about that as we opened the show. And it's such an important message. You write, making a difference is about the small choices we make each day. And for a lot of people, the choice that you made, that you tell about in Fender Bender, wouldn't be considered necessarily a small choice. Some people would make it very, very big. But this same thing has actually happened to me before. So when I read it, I was stunned, and I thought, Minerva and I have another thing in common. So tell me about this.
Well, I'll tell you, I got a lot of feedback, both pro and anti on that one. Most of us, we go through our lives at such speed, and we're in a bubble of work, daily routines, and things. We don't really think about the bigger picture, right? And so in this instance, I was rear-ended by a young man who didn't have insurance. We pulled over, and bless his heart, he was young and thin, and his poor car was in terrible disrepair. And I was all righteous indignation, and I was ready to let him have it, right? Because he had rear-ended me. And in that moment, I just thought, he wasn't hurt, I wasn't hurt. There was really not much damage there. Was it really that fender bender? Was that really important enough to, punish another person who was clearly having a hard time already? And my answer in that situation was no.
Yeah.
And so he was so stunned when I said, that's not a big deal, you know, nobody's hurt here, we're okay, no problem. And, you know, I drove away and he was still standing there stunned with his wallet and his driver's license in his hand, like thinking, what just happened here?
Yeah. Yeah. Because it probably is not something everyone would do. And but you doing that, I'm sure, is something he remembered long after that happened. And
well,
it's
one
something.
of the things I wanted to tell you about was, you know, the title of the book wasn't always Ordinary Angels. Originally, I wanted to call it Humble Hearts, because so many of the things in the book are about kindnesses done to me, for me. And just the humbleness and the kindness and the generosity that people have shown me, just in all kinds of different ways. It's just so many stories. You talk about how can you come up with so many stories? I could come up with many more stories. This was just a 2.5-year period. But I decided when I was pulling everything together that really what these average encounters with folks in El Paso were with ordinary angels.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my favorite story in the book is accompanied by this photo of art that says courage at the top. It's called Swimming Deep. That's the name of the column. And you write, when we recognize one another's pain and share it, we divide its power over us. That's also my favorite quote in the book. I love that quote.
Well, you know, we never know when we listen to the heartache of another person. We might find our own pain reflected in what they're telling us. And it creates a bond with them in that moment. And oftentimes, you know, we can't see ourselves when we're wrapped up in something. You know, we're tangled up into it and we really can't see past it and our own hurt and upset. And this woman was going through a terrible divorce at the time. And
but you didn't know that until you started to talk with her. She was a stranger, really.
Yes, and so as she began to tell me these things, you know, these circumstances don't make the person. Trouble that they are in reveal their character, right? It reveals them. And so in this case, you're listening and you're hearing what this person's going through, and we can help another person to see who they are. And this woman had such courage and such grace in a really difficult situation, but she didn't see that. I could see that, and I was able to help her to see that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story. This photo that we're going to look at now is a garden statue. It's part of the column Perspective. Tell me about that.
Well, I love my garden statue.
Yeah.
He looks so ancient and wise and ugly and beautiful. And I wrote the story because I wanted to share the idea that beauty is more than one thing. You know, my cracked and crumbling little statue is an example of something called wabi-sabi. And that's Japanese, and it means accepting the beauty of imperfection. So it's a way to look at things that's a little bit different. And finding beauty in each stage of our existence, you know, whether it's where we are now, every stage of our existence as human beings, and every stage of an item's existence, you know, from its newness through its wear to when, you know, it's coming apart. It's still beautiful, but it really takes how you look at things.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And I will have my wife read that. She talks about my car that's 16 years old.
Well, I've got you beat.
I've
got you beat because I've got a car that's, let's see, 21 years old.
Okay, so we're both in the same boat on that. You have a quote from another column that I know you were going to read for us. This is "Front porches make good neighbors."
Yes, indeed. And the quote is, "Why do El Paso's older neighborhoods feel so welcoming? Dotted with pocket parks, nearby swimming pools, libraries, or shops and restaurants, all within walking distance of each other, these spaces were designed to be shared. And they all have front porches."
Yeah, that makes a difference, doesn't it? And I guess growing up in El Paso, living in the region, that's something that was something you reflected upon in writing that column, that it's a chance that we have to meet our neighbors if they're sitting out front.
Well, I reflected on the idea because I was living in central El Paso and Manhattan Heights, and so this area has a lot of older, much older neighborhoods, older homes that were built a long time ago, ranch style with front porches. Some of them have wraparound porches. And of course, when you see the current kind of construction now, people have a front door, but they don't have a front porch.
No.
They tend to go into their garages and then into their houses from there, and never have an opportunity to like look around or sit out on their front porch and say, "Hey neighbor, how's it going?" In central El Paso, the streets are narrower too, so you could really literally carry on a conversation across the street from somebody if they're sitting on their front porch and you're sitting on yours. And when I would take walks there, people would be out on their front porches, socializing.
Yeah.
There was one woman that I talked to who would keep a little stand with paperback books out there and chairs, so that people could come and
Like
just
a free
sit
library.
sit on her front porch
No.
and read a book.
I loved reading that column, and I've read about some new housing developments in certain parts of the country where developers are intentionally putting out the front porch again, and people love it. People love it. Well, speaking of our surroundings, nature, particularly in a big city like El Paso, is a welcome sight. And in your column, Sanctuary of Scents, you honor those who bring us thousands of roses at El Paso's Municipal Rose Garden. And we have some photos of that garden. Tell me about this column.
Well, the Municipal Rose Garden in El Paso is amazing. I mean, the beautiful different kinds of roses that are there, grown over decades, and prize-winning, just gorgeous. And you find tourists there whenever I've gone to visit. I mean, there's people from foreign countries there, as well as families, local people who just walk from the neighborhood. Like I said, that Manhattan Heights area, there's a beautiful park there, huge park. And this rose garden is within walking distance from that park. The way these neighborhoods were constructed were for people to walk around in them. I mean, you could have a nearby grocery store, places to have coffee or get your tamales. It was made for walking around in, not driving off to some faraway mall or faraway store somewhere to get your meals or your produce or whatever. You had your local guys that you were used to, and you could just walk up the street and get your food or whatever you wanted to get. It was within walking distance.
Beautiful photos and a beautiful tribute to the people who made that happen. You have another quote from the column El Paso del Norte.
Yes. Yes, I do. The quote is, it was about this two women and a little boy who needed a ride to church one day. And I happened to go to 7-Eleven to buy a newspaper, and so the little boy approached me, so I took them to church. I knew sometimes you just know when you're meant to do a thing. And her description of El Paso del Norte and the City of the Crosses to the north, Mount Cristo Rey, the star on the mountain, all these various things, just the missions down south. it was like El Paso was surrounded with all these blessings. And it was just a blessed place. So my quote is, her description was beautiful and full of faith. In the rearview mirror, I saw tears in her eyes. She was telling me this story sitting in the back seat. And she squeezed my shoulder and nodded, pointing up, and said, "Este es El Paso del Norte." And what I believe she meant by that is that El Paso is more than just the Camino Real, you know, the pass for traders and travelers coming up from Mexico, the Santa Fe Trail, all these kinds of things, but more like a kind of spiritual passage. And that people from El Paso are a spiritual people, a spiritual community. You know, you'll find people who come here, whether it's for the Sun Bowl from out of town or the people who are relocated here from Katrina, they would say El Paso's people are so friendly, they're so generous, they're so welcoming. I mean, there are folks who were relocated here from Katrina who decided to stay.
Yeah.
Why? Because they were so welcomed and they felt they wanted to build a life here.
Yeah. It's a special place. You dedicate the book to your mom. Here is her photo next to the column, The Lottery. Tell me about that.
Well, my mom has had a number of health issues over the past year, and it's mainly her heart. And she is an avid lottery player. So when she was getting heart surgery at William Beaumont Army Medical Center, I took her some lottery tickets to cheer her up. And ultimately, we didn't win the lottery. But the good news is that my mom is still with us. She is at home and doing well. We're taking it day by day, and grateful for every day that we still have together, because we've had to deal with quite a bit over this past year.
And she is the one who encouraged you to write the book, so we have to give her that tribute today. I also, though, I don't want to run out of time here, that we get to see this wonderful photo of your late grandmother in the book. We both have lost our grandmothers in the last year, and we were both very close to our grandmothers. And I know that for both of us, they are very special people. You write about that in the column, Something Old, Something New.
Yes. Well, my grandmother lived to be 101. And as I said, we've had a tough time this past year. My mother was hospitalized, my grandmother hospitalized numerous times, and my aunt. And my aunt and my grandmother passed away. But my grandmother was a woman of style and grace, and she knew how to live. She surrounded herself with beauty. She bought the best things she could afford. She was the from scratch German cook and top-notch baker, and she lovingly tended her rose garden. And she would take me around with her, and she would teach me how to dress and how to have proper manners. And one time on a whim, she just gave me this beautiful little coin purse that she'd had since I was a little girl. And it was so beautiful. And she knew how to take care of things and make them last.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, when I wrote the column, I had just had that repaired by a shoe repair fella in central El Paso. And it's more than 10 years ago now. So I think it's about time I get it repaired again.
That's right. And your quote, and I love the line because I could relate to this so much with my own grandmother. You wrote, "My grandmother taught me that almost anything could last a lifetime if it's treated with care." And that reminded me of her too. So well, it's a beautiful line.
That's absolutely true. And I just wanted to say, when my mother was so sick and she was hospitalized, she'd always wanted me to put these columns together in a book.
Yeah.
She'd always wanted me to do that. And I never got around to it, but when she was so ill and we thought we were going to lose her, I was fortunate that Liam Llewellyn at LL Press got together with me and were able to make that happen for us so quickly. And I got an advance copy to her. She was hospitalized at Christmas. And I want to think that maybe that book had something to do with her getting well again.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. We have only about a minute left. The book is also available as an audiobook on Amazon.com. And in our last minute, I understand there's even a story related to that.
Well, there is. When the book came out, I posted some things on Facebook, and a woman contacted me saying, you know, she'd really like to have the book and get it for her mother and her mother-in-law, but they were not so good at reading. They couldn't really read very much, and so they asked if it was on an audiobook, where could they get it? And I hadn't thought of that. So once again, I contacted Liam at LL Press and asked, is it a possibility? Could we do this as an audiobook? And he said, absolutely. And so he's been working with me since then to try and get this done. It's recently completed and it's now available.
And it's in your
on
voice,
Audible.
right?
Yes, it's me reading
Your
it,
voice.
and it's on Audible and iBooks and many other platforms where you can get audiobooks.
Well, it has been delightful having you here on the show, and wish you the best of luck with the book and the audiobook.
Thank you so much, Fred. I really appreciate it.
Minerva Baumann, and the book is Ordinary Angels, Stories of Daily Life in El Paso del Norte. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you for joining us. That is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. We have all of the latest news for you on KRWG Radio. Morning edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.